Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Jason Bordoff. I'm the co-founding dean of the Columbia Climate School and the founding director of the Center on Global Energy Policy. Today, we're going to discuss how to best utilize the existing energy infrastructure to achieve a net zero future. And for those of you joining via Zoom, you can submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. This event, again, is being webcast live, and the full video will be available in the coming days on the website of the Center on Global Energy Policy. So just to set the scene, I will say that global efforts to curb climate change and hopefully keep temperature rise in check to 1.5 degrees Celsius or below, if carried through, would lead to a sharp reduction in fossil fuel consumption, cutting back on the amount of coal and oil and natural gas that we're burning. That's critical to transitioning the world to a lower carbon energy system needed to achieve decarbonization targets that the world will hopefully come together around in the UN climate meeting in just about a month's time. At the same time, achieving net zero doesn't mean zero use of oil and gas. The IEA recently came out with a landmark report on net zero 2050, finding in a net zero scenario in 2050, the world's using about a quarter as much oil, just under half as much natural gas. And to get from here to there, they also found that the amount of investment in the energy system annually, which is about $2 trillion per year today, and their estimate would need to rise to about $5 trillion per year through 2030. We had Mark Carney with us at Climate Week here at Columbia University just about a week ago, noting that we need about $120 trillion in his view of investment to meet our clean energy goals. So that's a lot of new energy infrastructure. But the question is, what about the trillions of dollars of existing energy assets that exist, most to support the hydrocarbon-based economy that we have today? Is that all stranded, or can some of it be utilized, repurposed in support of a clean energy economy? And then how do we reconcile any new capital investments in energy infrastructure that need to be aligned with net zero with the reality that today's energy system is very far from that, as energy shortages across Europe and Asia are reminding us acutely today? A deeply decarbonized world is one that will have large volumes of carbon capture, carbon utilization, removal, large volumes of hydrogen and ammonia, both blue and green. All of those can utilize existing natural gas infrastructure if investments are made to upgrade them, as a recent paper by some of my colleagues at the Center on Global Energy Policy explained. And in the meantime, we have to make sure that methane leaks are being managed in the system to achieve the maximum benefit one can and not exacerbate the climate crisis. And at the same time, investments in pipeline infrastructure raise understandable concerns that they risk locking in a fossil fuel future in for a longer period of time and might work against the energy transition. So there were a series of recommendations in that report I just mentioned about how to curb emissions caused by leakage in the existing network, as well as opportunities to refurbish sections of it to carry increasing levels of cleaner fuels through the existing energy infrastructure. Our discussion today occurs again against the backdrop of a global gas crunch. It's all happening as we face the prospect of entering the winter with dangerously low amounts of natural gas in storage. And today's discussion of natural gas infrastructure can't be divorced from the challenges we face in the world today, as well as where we need to get to, where the science tells us we need to get to for our climate goals by 2050. So with all that in mind, I'm really delighted to introduce an expert panel to discuss these topics. I'm going to introduce them one by one for some broad opening framing comments on the topic of the panel, and then we'll get into a moderated conversation and then bring questions in from the audience. So first, I'd like to hand it over to Martin Wetzler. Martin's the Director of Integrated Gas, Renewables, and Energy Solutions at Shell. He has thought a lot about where the energy system is headed, including near-term issues like methane leaks that I just talked about, but also what the energy transition will mean for a company like Shell and more broadly. Martin, let me turn it to you. Martin, I think you're muted.
I was indeed. After 1.5 years of training, you still get it wrong sometimes. Thanks, Jason, and good to see you. And ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Thanks for joining. I'm very pleased to spend some time with you on this important topic. But before we go into the urgent changes that are necessary in the world of energy, I want to start to talk about a man from New York who initiated an entirely different kind of change. His name was Samuel Morse, and in 1844, to be exact on May the 1st, he used his invention, which was the electronic telegraph, to send the results of the Democratic National Convention that was held in Baltimore to Washington. And the speed of that electronic communication was instantly recognized by everybody as revolutionary. Although it was misunderstood by many. There's an anecdote of somebody trying to send a plate of sauerkraut to a relative in another town by the telegraph. But others did understand better that electricity transmits information far more quickly than if it was sent by horse or train or ship. And in fact, the telegraph at the time in 1844 paired up with newspapers, transforming worldwide communication by bringing news to readers much faster from every corner of the world. Now it's a small, but it's a very significant example of change. And I want you to keep it in mind, because the same that was true for this relatively small change is true for the huge change the world faces today as it needs to tackle climate change. When it thinks about a way to really make progress, it needs to combine the existing with the new. And let me start with the new parts. Of course, today's energy system will have to be electrified as much as possible. We need to electrify anything that moves or that's stationary and needs energy. And that means a lot of new infrastructure for renewables. At Shell, we developed a sketch recently to see what it would take for the US to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. Among many other things, it could mean that by 2050, the US will need to have 20,000 wind turbines built every year. It will need to triple its transmission infrastructure, and it will need to cover 4% of its surface, which is roughly New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Ohio together, with solar panels. None of that's easy. But even if the US could install all the necessary solar panels and wind turbines tomorrow, it would still not be enough to achieve net zero emissions, because there are just very significant parts of the economy that cannot be easily or affordably electrified with today's, but not even with tomorrow's technology. Think about the production of steel and cement or petrochemicals, where you need a molecule to start with, but also transport by planes and ships and heavy trucks. Those sectors need to find their own and different pathways to net zero emissions. And essentially, they're going to need a molecule. And certainly advanced biofuels and hydrogen will play a crucial role in those sectors in the future. But they're not sufficiently available yet. It will take time to scale up their production to become a meaningful part of the energy mix. And in the meantime, the carbon emissions keep going. So for a long time to come, the world will also still need oil and gas to make things go around. It still needs existing part of the energy system along with the new. And since natural gas infrastructure can be retrofitted for renewables, as Jason already pointed out, and since natural gas has environmental advantages compared to other fossil fuels like coal and oil, continued investment in infrastructure for both renewables and natural gas are not just appropriate, they're necessary. It's just like the newspapers and the telegraph working together to eventually create a digital future. Companies like Shell can and should play a large role on both ends. But the energy transition is far too big a challenge for companies to face on their own. Yes, of course, it will require businesses like ours to offer low carbon energy. And it will require consumers to choose these low carbon products and services. But perhaps most of all, it will require government policies that create the right climate for investments and help steer society towards low carbon energy. And since governments play such a crucial part, I'm pleased with the Biden administration's climate ambitions. Having rejoined the Paris Agreement, appointed both a domestic champion and a foreign envoy to tackle climate change. I'm glad that the US government is now using regulations and incentives to promote low carbon energy, including technologies to capture and store carbon emissions, including reducing methane emissions. It's policies like these that enable companies and consumers to change. Consider hydrogen, for example. Ideally, there would be only hydrogen that's made from renewables, using electrolyzers. But there's not nearly enough renewable power in the world to produce all the hydrogen necessary to decarbonize the sectors of industry, shipping, heavy-duty road transport. And this is where the right policies come in, to enable all types of decarbonized hydrogen. This includes hydrogen made from natural gas combined with carbon capture and storage. This lower carbon alternative can encourage companies to switch to hydrogen-fueled factories, trucks, and ships much earlier than if they all have to wait for the green hydrogen to arrive. And it can also kickstart the development of a hydrogen infrastructure and the conversion of some of the natural gas infrastructure to that hydrogen infrastructure. There's a lot more I could say in my opening words, but I promise to keep it short. So yes, we urgently need more renewables and we are investing in it. But thinking that the world can do without oil and gas today is like trying to send a plate of sauerkraut through an electric telegraph. It won't work. The world needs to combine the existing and the new to ensure a successful energy transition. And I look forward to discussing that with you today. Thank you.
Martin, thanks so much for those framing remarks. Really important issue you put on the table to identify how to address the energy system we have today, but not in any way take steps that make it more difficult to get where we need to be much more quickly than we're moving today, which is almost not at all, with oil, gas, and even coal use continuing to rise, even as the ambition, again driven by the science, becomes even stronger. Let me turn next. Melanie, you've thought a lot about that topic I just identified and written about it. My friend Melanie Kenderdine is the principal of the Energy Futures Initiative, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, former senior official in the Department of Energy during the administration of President Obama. Melanie, let me turn it to you.
Thank you so much, Jason. Thanks to the other panelists. This is a terrific group of people. Thanks for the invitation to speak today. Thanks to the audience for your participation. I'm going to start off with a little joke. I'm in New Mexico. I've been here for since COVID, and I was invited to give the commencement address at the University of New Mexico. That's where I went to school, and they invited me to give the commencement address this May. It was live. The students came. Their families couldn't come, but the students were there and live at the football stadium. And the two jokes that I used, or the joke that I used when I was talking to them, and the women in the audience will get this in particular, is for the first time in 15 months, I've actually combed the back of my hair. And I'm not wearing pajama bottoms. And I'm not wearing them today either. I have to go somewhere. But let me start off by saying I have read parts of your study, major parts of your study. I think it's excellent. I've already started making slides from some of the information in there. Those of you who know me know that I am a slide freak. And so that's a major compliment to the study. And my hat's off to Columbia for what I think is very important to work. And let me say that we at the Energy Futures Initiative have also been looking at how to repurpose and reuse existing infrastructures for a clean energy future. We think it's critical that we repurpose and reuse existing infrastructure because of the urgency of addressing climate change, among other reasons. And a little data on that urgency: the Biden administration is going to be formalizing its new NDCs in Glasgow, referenced by Jason earlier. That has a target of 50% reduction in economy-wide emissions by 2030, measured against a 2005 baseline. I'd like to put that in perspective. Between 2005 and 2018, the US cut its emissions by 662 metric tons, a rate of 59.2 metric tons per year. To meet the new target, we will have to cut our emissions by another 2,692 metric tons, 224 metric tons a year, at a rate that's 4.4 times faster than the previous 12 or 13 years. And that assumes that we have actually made progress between 2018 and 2021. I'm sure we made progress this year because of COVID, but it remains to be seen. Another point: the time from invention to commercialization for lithium-ion batteries, that was 37 years. For mobile phones, it was 39 years. For solar energy, it was 56 years. The urgency of addressing climate change and the value of early gains. CO2 is compounding in the atmosphere as we speak. This says that the technologies we need in the near, even to meet mid and near and midterm targets, are already commercialized or in the later stages of development. So that's an important point too. And a related point, data from a study of EFI did on deep decarbonization in California showed that in 2017, California had 90 days in 1 year with little to no wind. Those are data, not modeling, data. It had 10 to 11 days in a row with no wind. The duration of current battery storage technologies is 4 hours. We need breakthroughs in storage technologies to ensure the reliability of our grid. Until then, we need a fuel. That was the conclusion of the study. That's currently natural gas. As Martin mentioned, it could be hydrogen in the future, and we need it as soon as possible. And finally, the infrastructure we need to meet these targets will be extensive. However, a couple of headlines from stories, press stories that I've looked at about infrastructure siting underscore a big problem for urgent action. Quote, protesters oppose Central Maine Power's proposed 140-mile transmission line. Or quote, the Hamptons love green energy, but oh, that wind farm. Or quote, pipeline transmission line opposition heard by Holt County leaders. You get the picture. At a time when action on climate is urgently needed, opposition to siting the needed infrastructure is strong. To meet aggressive electrification of key sectors, we will need to double the size of our electricity transmission system in the US. To achieve early gains on emissions reductions, we will have to work with today's technologies. We need a fuel in the near to midterm to support variable renewables, and we need all of that as soon as possible. This is a long way of saying we need to be creative about uses and reuses of existing infrastructure, something the Columbia paper ably and strongly articulates. An area where we are focused on at EFI is slightly different kind of infrastructure. And that infrastructure, and I would call it infrastructure, are existing rights of way, and how we might use or repurpose those to support clean energy technologies like hydrogen and grid modernization, or CCUS. We're also looking at incentives that could be used to make CCUS pipelines that we would invest in today hydrogen ready, to avoid stranding those assets as we go to a net zero future and ultimately to green hydrogen. And so that's just a few thoughts on the topic of the day. And I am going to have to drop off in a few minutes for a critical meeting that got scheduled on Friday, but I will be back shortly. And thank you again.
Thanks, Melanie. Look forward to having you back for the discussion after a few additional comments people have made, and you put some great issues on the table, including the challenges with permitting and siting infrastructure. I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about that last year, and you noted both pipelines and transmission lines, and I think I want to come back to that because I think the concerns that motivate the opposition to both are different, and obviously one raises questions about lock-in of existing fossil fuel infrastructure more than another. I want to come back to that hopefully when you rejoin us. But let's get our final two guests to share their opening perspectives to frame the conversation. I'll turn next to Maria Elena Drew. She's the Director of Research for Responsible Investing at T. Rowe Price. Maria, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much for inviting T. Rowe to speak on your panel. I'm here to give the investors' perspective today, but I'm not T. Rowe's energy analyst. I'm the DOR for Responsible Investing. So I'm going to be providing you with an ESG lens today. So the consideration of ESG factors in the investment process continues to accelerate rapidly. The level of adoption has been varying by region, but we are seeing that it's rising everywhere. We find that it's becoming more ubiquitous that our clients expect environmental and social factors to be part of the investment decision in some way, shape, or form. However, we can see really big differences in how our clients want those ESG objectives within their portfolios. So the vast majority of our clients at T. Rowe now expect ESG integration to be part of the investment process. And this is mirrored across the whole industry. This means considering environmental, social, and governance factors for the purpose of enhancing investment performance. At T. Rowe, we've embedded these factors across our entire research platform. We think it's just good common sense. Why wouldn't you look at an environmental or a social factor that could be impacting the investment case for one of the companies? But a growing proportion of our clients want us to embed sustainable objectives in their investment portfolios. Some of these clients do it because they believe it will lead to better performance, and some of them do it because they want their values reflected in their investment. And then you have another cohort who are doing it for both of those reasons. And investment products with sustainable objectives are typically labeled as sustainable or impact. In Europe, net flows into these products are above 100%. While in the United States, the figure is much, much lower. It's currently below 10%, but it is growing. It's growing very rapidly off a low base. I give you this background because the most dominant sustainable objective being seen in the marketplace is mitigating climate change. It's also one of the most dominant factors being considered by those doing ESG integration. So how a company's position vis-a-vis climate change is going to matter to most investors. And some investors are going to weigh this against other financial factors, and some of them are not. So if a company is exposed to fossil fuels, some of these investors just aren't going to be willing to buy it, period. As we look at the challenge that is transitioning to a net zero world, we're basically trying to take 100+ years of energy investment and do a 180 reverse engineering of it in less than 30 years. So this is going to be really, really tough, and it's going to require a huge amount of financing. In order for fossil fuel companies to get their full fair share of this financing, they're going to need to prove to the investment community that they're genuinely committed and able to deliver on a net zero pathway. So I think as we think about utilizing some of that infrastructure, we'll have to think about how accepting investors are of that process. So on that note, I'm going to turn it back to you, Jason.
Thanks. Appreciate those framing marks. Several things I want to come back to you on too in the context of the particular topic today and how we think about where capital goes for the infrastructure that we need moving forward. But Dimitrios, let me bring you in finally. Dimitrios Papathanasiou is the Global Director for the World Bank's Energy and Extractives Global Practice. Would love to hear your thoughts on this, particularly with the global perspective you have. The challenges, the opportunities, the solutions look different in different parts of the world, in developing versus developed versus emerging economies. Would love to hear your perspective on how we think about making this transition and what it means for the infrastructure we already have today.
Thank you very much, Jason, and thanks to everyone at Columbia for inviting us in this conversation, which is very timely and extremely important. So from my perspective, let me start off by making sure we're using more or less the right definitions when we discuss the issue of stranded assets. And what we think is that a stranded asset these are costs that refer to unanticipated or premature write-downs, devaluations, and suddenly having an asset that suddenly becomes a liability. So this is the way we look at stranded assets conceptually. And we feel that the common drivers of these stranded costs are changes in regulation, policies, environmental shifts, resource availability changes. Sometimes it's a result of poor system planning, changing of competitiveness of alternative technologies. And sometimes it's also the evolving social norms and consumer behavior. And without a doubt, policies on climate change, accelerating the decarbonization, sharply reducing greenhouse gas emissions are going to create a large number of stranded assets in the energy sector. So let me just give you a little bit of a sense. We focused on some work that we're doing right now on the power sector for electricity generation, and in particular fossil fuel power stations. And what is important is that according to our estimates, it is World Bank countries that are served as clients to the World Bank, essentially the developing world. They account for about 93% of the capital that is invested in coal-fired power generation, and it is at risk of being stranded. So if we want to eliminate all the emissions from today's coal fleet, which is roughly 2,100 gigawatts, and if we want to do this by 2040, which is barely enough if we want to remain within the targets of the Paris Agreement, then that means that about 100 gigawatts of coal capacity need to be retired each year for the next 20 years. And that means that almost every day until 2040, we need to be taking out of service one coal power unit. So the challenge is enormous. And while we see the average economic lifetime of coal plants at 40 years, almost 2/3 of the world's fleet is about 20 years old or less. So again, as an estimate and rounding up the figures a little bit, or maybe rounding them down, we feel that the global coal power fleet will exhaust most of the remaining global carbon budget, or approximately there will be about $1 trillion of stranded assets in the power sector that need to be managed, retired, or repurposed. And a significant number of that is owned by national and subnational entities and governments in the developing world. And of course, China and India are among the major countries where these figures are very important. Putting things into perspective as well, we try to estimate what is the value of these stranded assets in terms of GDP. And the values range from country to country. And of course, it depends a lot on the kind of assumptions you put on future cash flows of these assets. But we're looking at anywhere between 2%, 5%, in some cases 10% of GDP for these countries. These are very high numbers. They're very significant. And especially in today's world, where after the COVID crisis, we have been seeing the macroeconomic situation of most of governments being stressed and the levels of debt going up very significantly, things present an enormous challenge. And I was listening to you earlier in the kind of numbers that will be required to finance the energy transition, and are indeed daunting. I mean, I think lately we're using trillions more and more often as the unit of figure of speech when we're referring to investments in infrastructure globally. And I think it is important that we do that so that the world is aware of what is happening and the level of challenge that we're facing. But since we've been talking about trillions, let me also put on the table another figure which I think is important to take into account. Despite everything that is happening today in energy markets and all the sharp spikes in pricing that we see around the world as the world is coming out of COVID, and we see both a supply and a demand shock in our sector, today there's still about 15 trillion assets, bonds, which are earning a negative return. Let me say the number again. It's $15 trillion, which are official debt that are earning a negative return. And even my own country, my home country, Greece, which is notorious for its difficulties on the macro side, they did manage a few months back for a short-term debt to get a negative interest rate. And I think that is an important consideration that shows that we live in a very special time. We have enormous financial needs, and there are significant unexpected or unprecedented events that are taking place in financial markets, which I think show a lot of things that we should take into account as we think about the energy sector. The energy sector is the world's largest business. There's no doubt about that. We have cash flows that run to the trillions of dollars if you put everything together. And these are mostly, in today's world, recurring costs that go into fuels. And I think the fundamental challenge that we're looking at is how do we make the transformation of these recurring costs into servicing capital expenditures, and how can we do this at global scale and moving clearly matters into clean energy. Let me finish off by saying that in the work that we've done on coal power plants, we are finding out that we just recently put out a report for a notional coal power plant in India. We find out that even when you shut down a power plant, there is a lot of locked value in it as an asset, even if it is not producing power. And this should not be underestimated when we're making our calculations and where we're thinking about how do we do the transition. Finally, and I don't know, probably we won't have enough time to discuss this, but I just wanted to note that it's an extremely important issue, especially in the countries where we work, the whole concept of a just transition. And how do you deal with the workers, definitely in the coal mining sector and in the coal supply chain, but I think increasingly in the oil and gas sector. How do you deal with the workers that they spend their lives and they're taking pride in powering the economies of all these countries? And how do you deal with their transition away from the fossil fuel economy? Let me stop here, Jason. I'm sure we'll have plenty to discuss going forward. Thank you.
Thanks. Great comments, Dimitrios. And that number you gave, 5-10% GDP stranded assets, how did you think about the topic of today's panel, which is the potential for existing energy infrastructure to be repurposed or used in other ways? Is that factored in?
It is and it isn't, because to be able to do it properly, you're going to have to, in many cases, redesign your systems and then figure out how you can extract the value that you think it is in there. So again, to take it, for instance, I think Martin talked a little bit about pipelines. In the parts of the world where we work, we mostly are focusing on the power sector. And I think if you look, for instance, at the location of a coal power plant, the associated transmission infrastructure that goes with it, the land that surrounds it, there is significant value there. There is even significant value in the scrap metal. If you decide to take everything down and sell it off as scrap, even there is significant value. So this is work that we're doing right now. We have it underway. And some results might come up before COP26. Most of them, I think, will come out later. But for sure, and the values are there. Our estimates are not net value of stranded assets. We haven't gone into the exercise of calculate the net value of that. But still, you have to bear in mind that because raising the capital for many of these governments is not an easy exercise, even the notion of having to curb and shut down some of these power plants is a very difficult exercise, because they need to not only replenish the energy, but they need to figure out how they're going to pay for liabilities for some of these power plants that are with their financial sector. So it's a complex exercise.
Great, thank you. So again, just a reminder for those watching online, I'm Jason Bordoff. I'm here with Maria Elena Drew, Director of Research, Responsible Investing at T. Rowe Price. Our friend Melanie Kenderdine will be back very shortly. Dimitrios Papathanasiou is Global Director for Energy and Extractive Practice at the World Bank. And Martin Wetzeler is the Director of Integrated Gas, Renewables, and Energy Solutions at Royal Dutch Shell. And we're discussing how to best use the existing energy infrastructure to achieve our net zero goals. So we're going to move into the moderated discussion now. I'm going to ask a couple of questions, but I want to make it as interactive as possible. So please jump in, pose questions to one another if you wish, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience in a little bit. So again, please tee those up now if you have them. For those of you joining via Zoom, you can submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Martin, let me start with you, if I could, and just sort of jump to what I suspect is, with the topic of this session, with the comments that have been made so far, what I imagine some people may wonder watching this and listening to you talk about the energy system we have today, and then the one we need to get to in the future. When we talk about technologies like carbon capture or hydrogen, particularly blue hydrogen that utilizes gas with CCS, there is a concern that these are technologies that may not materialize and be commercialized at the scale that we need. They'll be used as justification to continue to invest in hydrocarbon infrastructure, and that'll perpetuate and create more longevity to the hydrocarbon infrastructure when the goal of the transition is to move in the other direction. So you're a company that is supplying a lot of the energy that the world needs today, and you're also thinking about what Shell looks like decades down the road. How would you respond to the skepticism that I suspect some viewers have that this is going to make it harder, not easier, to move in that direction? And, to use a term some people throw out there, that there's some degree of greenwashing going on when we hear people in the energy sector talk about issues like this.
Yeah, no, I totally understand that concern, Jason, and concerns in general about the lack of pace when it comes to energy transition, because it isn't occurring at nearly the pace it needs to occur. And it's a complex problem, because if we put all the money that is available to be invested into energy into creating clean energy in the coming 10 years, then there's likely to be a deficit of energy versus what is required for consumption. And you already see today, Dimitri has talked about a fair transition. You already see today with energy prices rising, that becomes a real big problem for poorer households in the West, let alone for consumers who need to pay a lot for their gasoline in their motorbike in India. So we need to thread the needle of producing just enough of today's energy so the world can continue to turn and people can continue to live and build their lives and livelihoods while it transitions. And that does require investment in kind of all of the above. You can't stop investing in oil and gas because it will decline 5% per year. And the world is not ready with alternatives growing at 5% per year, because the size of the global energy system is just so large. It will take more time than that. So you have to continue to do that. But if you overdo it, then you could suppress alternatives. So to me, the point is about making sure these alternatives are advantaged from a perspective of subsidies or less taxes, and that you put more carbon prices and higher taxes on the fossil side. So that becomes actually interesting for consumers to switch, and if you can do it in that way, then you can have a demand-led energy transition, which I think is far superior from a supply-led energy transition. Because if you simply suppress the supply of energy, then you get very high prices. If you suppress the demand for example, fossil fuels, then the price will be lower and supply will go down. You asked about blue hydrogen, and I think it's a really fascinating topic. The problem that we have in most countries is that to make a lot of green hydrogen, you need a lot of clean power. But we need that clean power as well to green the grids. You can't do both at the same time. So as long as there's still a lot of gray or even coal power on the grids, you want to use your green power just to green those grids. Now you're going to postpone the hydrogen economy by 10 or 20 years because you haven't greened your grid yet, or you're going to get going with blue hydrogen, which is a lot better than gray, which you can make today with natural gas and CCS, and get the hydrogen economy going. And then over time, as green hydrogen becomes more available and more clean power becomes available, for sure you would phase it out. But to pause and not do it and not start to decarbonize heavy transport, decarbonize industry, I think will be a mistake.
Yeah, your comments made me think of two, because I'm an avid consumer of what the IEA produces, two things recently from the IEA. One, of course, was your comment about investing in the in supply today, even as we transition. And their landmark Net Zero 2050 report made a lot of news for the headline: no investment in new fossil fuel supply is needed. It's acknowledging people can agree or disagree with their own analysis, but in the Net Zero 2050 scenario, they did find very large amounts of investment were needed in existing supply. And then the question of whether new supply is needed kind of depends on which scenario you're looking at. They're 1.5, or they're well below 2, or they're 2-degree scenario. And then the second was they have a hydrogen review just came out today, actually, and it kind of speaks to the last point you were making, because I think sometimes people say, well, green, we can do it all. We can put renewables onto the grid and we can make the green hydrogen we need. And I thought the report was useful for many reasons, but including the scale of what it means to produce the amount of hydrogen we're talking about in some of these scenarios and how quickly that needs to grow. The report noted that global capacity of electrolyzers doubled over the last 5 years. And if all of these projects are realized, global hydrogen supply from electrolyzers would reach 8 million tons by 2030. And in their net zero 2050 pathway, you need 10 times that, 80 million tons versus 8 million by 2030. So we need a lot more renewables, a lot more electrolyzers, a lot more investment to get just that green hydrogen. And then, as you said, we're not close to being on track yet to decarbonize the electrons themselves before we potentially create molecules from that green energy. Demetrius, I'd love to hear your reaction to that and how at the World Bank you think about that tension, if there is one, between meeting the development needs and supplying the energy that the world needs today, how you think about deploying capital there, but doing it in a way that is consistent with and does not slow the pace of transition moving forward.
So in terms of ensuring access to people that do not have access today, our estimate is that there is still about 800 million people in the world that don't even have electricity. That's about one out of 6, 1 out of 7 people in the world. So that is a big challenge. However, what we also see is that now probably the cheapest and easier and fastest way to start serving unelectrified populations, especially in slightly remote areas, is clean energy. Some combination of renewable energy and batteries. And I would like to subscribe to a lot of what Martin said about the role of hydrogen as a fuel that can really bridge the world to totally clean energy systems. The ultimate solution will be some combination of wind, solar, water energy, combined with short-term storage through batteries and longer-term storage through hydrogen. And I do believe, and I agree with Martin, that once the industry is able to transparently demonstrate the emissions and the control of emissions of blue hydrogen, then clearly there will be a much bigger role for this fuel into the energy mix. And without a doubt, the more because one of the things that keeps, for instance, fuel cell engines and the fuel cell applications to spread much faster in the world is the lack of infrastructure fuel for hydrogen. I mean, if you have a fuel cell car, there's very few places in the world that you can refuel. And even if we can put blue hydrogen into the system, but increase this refueling infrastructure, I think we need that to create the bridges that will take us to the ultimate solution, which of course is green hydrogen. And then you can go to really totally clean systems, at least for the power sector and increasingly in transportation. And at the moment, at least from a technical perspective, that can all work. I mean, the technology is there and it works. So the question is, how do you bring manufacturing at scale on electrolyzers that you mentioned in the production of fuel cells, so that we can accelerate that? And I think this is the challenge that needs government support and policy support to happen. It is beginning to happen in the European Union now on hydrogen. I think it will slowly come and become stronger in the US as well. And of course, in Japan, we see Asia and China leading the charge. And even in India now, there's a hydrogen mission. So these are all good signs. And if they are sustained in the next, I would say, 5 to 10 years, then the world has a chance to really move towards net zero. But it will require policy support.
Maria, let me turn to you. I'm interested in your perspective on this and how you think about the way clients see it, how you think about the way financial institutions see it. And I don't know if it's helpful with some specific examples, but imagine a financial institution saying, we're going to finance a new natural gas plant that can be repurposed because we're going to build it in a certain way with carbon capture down the road, or to run on hydrogen down the road, or a pipeline that is built in a way, we're going to finance it, but we're going to build it so that it can be used to deliver low carbon synthetic fuels when they are available. And it would apply to other things beyond gas infrastructure too, right? You'd imagine a large financial institution saying we're going to buy a coal plant, we're going to invest to make it as efficient as possible, and we will retire it in 10 to 15 years, or we're going to finance a steel plant that's a very heavy emitter and finance it with investments to make sure it's operating at maximum efficiency. Some would view those as what responsible investing should do, because that is where the world is today. And it's thinking about where the world is headed. And some would say, no, that's not responsible investing. We need to cease investment in fossil fuels to get to the clean energy future we need as fast as possible. When you think about the phrase responsible investing, or ESG, how do you think about the way financial institutions and others should view the tension we've been talking about?
And I think it's also just really important to recognize that the term ESG only means environment, social, and governance, doesn't mean anything else. So it's an umbrella term that can sometimes describe very different investment styles. So I guess a couple issues I think about with the question. One is, you gave three scenarios: buying a coal plant, a natural gas plant, and a steel plant, and working to make them greener, which should all, in theory, be positive things to do. I think that probably the steel plant is the easiest one for the investment community to get behind, because that's seen as, a hard to abate emissions there. So that's probably the easiest of the three. I guess natural gas would come second, and then coal would be, I think, the toughest pill for anybody to be able to swallow on that one. Let me just walk you through the rationale there. When we look at most investors will be doing ESG integration. So just considering ESG for the purpose of enhancing performance. If you think about the prospect of buying a coal plant, and you're going to work to make it as clean as possible until you shut it down, that asset's going to have to be awfully cheap when you purchase it, in order to have it be a particularly attractive investment, especially compared to other industries. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. Now, potentially it is extremely cheap, and that's an interesting investment, but it's really going to have to depend on that entry price. But you know that there's a finite life to that coal plant, and it should be pretty soon. It's going to be a lot sooner than that natural gas plant and the steel plant. So I think that is a tough investment, even for those just doing ESG integration. If we're looking at the other camp of investors that want a sustainable objective, we're finding that coal is, in any way, shape, or form, is just not palatable. So, that's the most common exclusion that we see from clients related to the environment. And when I talk about coal, I mean just thermal coal. And then if we look at the natural gas plant situation, we at TRO think that natural gas is going to be a very important transition fuel. And if we think about a just transition, it's pretty critical that we have natural gas. Otherwise, it's going to be tough to keep the lights on. It's going to be tough for politicians to stay in office and to put policies in place for energy transition. However, I would say that if we look at fugitive methane, that's pretty harmful to the environment. So methane has a global warming potential, which is 28 times that of carbon. So as investors, we would want to have a lot of confidence that the plant was really being run properly, and we would need to have companies reporting very diligently, having those numbers externally assured or audited, and also reporting numbers that are comparable across industry. So while we might look at one company, so say if a company like Royal Dutch Shell chose to do that project, we'd have very high confidence in how they were executing it and what they would report around that. You could look at other companies, maybe smaller companies choosing to do that. We would have less confidence in those numbers. So all of those fund flows going into sustainable and impact funds are going to have some challenges getting behind that natural gas asset, some of which industry could work to alleviate. And I think another aspect that would also be an important turning point there is going to be, the decision from the EU on whether or not natural gas ends up in the EU taxonomy as a transition. I think that'll be a pretty important determinant in how the world views that. So maybe I'll leave it there and turn it back to you, Jason.
Thanks. I'd love to hear Martin respond to that, and then Demetrius, if you want as well, because you spent a lot of time, Martin, thinking about how the industry can come together to make more progress on methane emissions. And methane leaks are a real problem in many parts of the world. We'll have more scrutiny and understanding of that as more satellite data comes in the coming years. And it's an issue that'll be front and center at the COP meeting in a month in a way I'm not sure we've seen at previous COPs. Can you just talk a little bit about where you think we are with that, what more needs to be done to address the concerns Maria just described?
Yeah, Jason, indeed, as you know, I've been very concerned about methane leakage for quite some time, and been trying to get the industry's attention to it, and with various institutions such as yours, but also the World Bank and IEA and the UN and quite a number of progressive companies in this area. I think a lot of progress has been made in terms of showing what good looks like. On the front of how you actually manage an operation and to avoid methane leaks in the upstream and the midstream, and so on let's say the front of policies, procedures, and operating, how you operate, but also on policies and procedures for governments. We have drafted example policies and regulations for governments to adopt to really suppress methane leaks in their countries. And so what good looks like is now pretty clear when it comes to methane, whether you operate a gas plant or gas pipeline, or whether you're in charge of a country. Now, getting it implemented at scale is the next challenge. And although there's a little bit of, we are triggering action in the industry as a result of our initiative, we need much faster and tougher take-up by governments to simply regulate methane emissions. It's not that hard. What good looks like is available. It just needs to be done because it's totally unnecessary for methane to leak into the atmosphere. It's not expensive, as the IEA always points out. You can get well below 0.5% leakage without actually losing money, because of course you're basically containing the product you want to sell. But companies often just don't have the incentive to do it because they see it, they don't see it as economically important, but it's environmentally hugely important for the future of the industry and for the future of basically serving the planet responsibly with energy. So we call on governments everywhere to regulate methane emissions tightly and toughly, and we've basically designed for them how to do it. The final thing where I'm a little bit hopeful is that I do think, and people like the Rocky Mountains Institute are working on this, that we're going to see more and more certification of natural gas, where actually the methane leakage that has happened as part of getting natural gas to the endpoint becomes a feature of the natural gas cargo or shipment you're buying, and hopefully consumers can in that way help reward low methane value chains and punish high methane value chains. And indeed, we've been working with the European Union to start to describe standards for imports in order to export high standards for methane to all the places in the world, including Russia, including the US, including North Africa and the Caspian, export tough methane regulations to the rest of the world by setting import standards. So, but I believe voluntary action is always great, and we've come away some way, but we need regulation.
There's I was going to ask a question, and I'm also now going to incorporate audience questions in, and there's several that overlap with the things I was going to ask anyway, so that's good. So one question I had, Martin, was we're talking a lot about existing infrastructure and how it can be used in a transition. There's been a lot of discussion about pipelines, say natural gas pipelines, and how to move low carbon synthetic fuels like hydrogen around. But I was going to ask you what else we should be talking about when you think about the existing energy infrastructure of ports, ships. There's a question here about how feasible it is to modify current LNG infrastructure for hydrogen. Can you comment a little bit on that? Oh, I think you're still muted. Or, yeah.
I wasn't. Yeah, it's. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I mean, if you look at if simply for some of the simple things, indeed, you can transport CO2 or hydrogens through many gas pipelines, not through all of them. As you point out in your study, you may need to upgrade some, but I think, for example, the port of Rotterdam in the Netherlands is going to be sending a lot of hydrogen to Germany in the future and be getting a lot of CO2 back and then stored in the North Sea, and that can be done through partly existing pipelines. And even if it's not existing pipelines, you should see a right of way, particularly in densely populated areas, also as an asset. If you have a right of way that you can put an extra hydrogen or a CO2 pipeline through, then that's a significant asset, because otherwise you're never going to build a pipeline in big cities and in densely populated parts of the world. So these are assets. On the LNG front, unfortunately, because you're then thinking about long-range transport of hydrogen. Of course, hydrogen is the lightest element in the universe, so it needs minus 260 degrees to liquefy. And you then need different steel grades to contain it than you can with LNG. So the tanks and the ships that exist that make LNG a global business can't be reused one-on-one for liquid hydrogen, but many of the technologies can be, and much of the technological understanding can be applied to building that hydrogen infrastructure, but you can't use the same assets for it. Of course, once the hydrogen is back into gaseous forms, you're into the discussion that we just had. But one of the interesting things is that many fuel cells can also operate on natural gas. So one of the things that we are discussing with the shipping industry is to say, could you start to build fuel cell power ships now, fire them with natural gas, and over time, as the technology to actually have hydrogen on ships, which is still a bit difficult given the mid-ocean conditions and the various temperature changes that you have, could you then switch it over to hydrogen? So I think there are certainly all kinds of overlaps and options that exist, but particularly energy infrastructure, unfortunately, isn't straightforward.
Demetrios, did you have, I saw you nodding to pieces of that. Did you want to comment on any of that, and more broadly, how you and the World Bank think about, the investment in the infrastructure we have and need today, and how it can be? Is there a tension between continuing to invest in infrastructure for hydrocarbons like natural gas, and then saying, well, down the road when we're ready, we'll use it for zero carbon energy instead?
There certainly is a tension, and I think the primary driver of the tension at the moment is perceptions of the public, especially in Europe, definitely among the younger generation, that every fossil fuel is a bad fuel, and this is the reality. So there's very aggressive civil society campaigning against natural gas. In our case, I mean, just recently, the U.S. Treasury issued a guidance on how the US will be voting on multilateral development banks when it comes to gas projects. And you can see that there is an increasing reluctance to support natural gas. And this is driven by the urgency to get to zero emissions. Now, this is the reality of perceptions, and this is the reality of where the climate change crisis is moving the world. On the other hand of the ledger, of course, we have the continuous and growing demand for high quality, reliable energy services. And that tension is not yet resolved. That is without a doubt. That tension is there. And I think what would help, and Martin alluded to that, is to have really good transparency from the major oil and gas companies on the quality and the environmental impact of their fuel. And we talked a lot about the tremendous financial needs for the energy transition. And my view is that it is essentially the large energy companies of the world that have a lot of the financial muscle, they have tremendous know-how, they understand the business. And they are the ones that can act significantly into doing this transition. Now, the more you have, on the other hand, investors pushing for higher level environmental and social standards, the more all of these things are going to come together. I mean, having conversation with oil and gas companies, and almost between the lines, you can hear them saying, well, you know, give us a carbon price. If you give us a carbon price, there's a lot that we can do. And there's certainly projects and opportunities and investments that have been studied, and they are definitely technically feasible. And with a carbon price at an appropriate level, they could actually happen. So I think that is a huge policy challenge, frankly, for the world. I mean, if you have a proper carbon price, this will certainly accelerate the energy transition. And I think it will create a more clear field of view and horizon for the oil and gas companies. And my view is that, you know, oil and gas companies are needed for the energy transition. They have to be on the right side of where the world is going, and they can contribute a lot.
Great to see Melanie back with us. I'll turn to you in a minute. There is a question from the audience about whether you think an escalating carbon pricing approach would allow the market to make the needed changes to infrastructure that would move us in a direction of dropping our emissions. I don't know if Maria, you have thoughts about that, or Martin, you do, and then I'll come to Melanie about that. But I also want to turn to one or two other topics too that I was holding in reserve, including what policymakers do about all of this.
So jump in on the carbon question.
Please, yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so I think one of the challenges that we've seen as investors is that I think one of the easiest things for regulators to do was to drive more sustainable finance. So they've been able to do that a bit faster, and for that reason, we're starting to see some of the sustainable finance regulations come into effect before the actual companies who have to make the energy transition are getting the regulation, which has been tough for us as investors. And I think seeing more action from regulators would help, because you can, you know, if you think we're moving to a net zero world, we as investors are going to anticipate that in our investments. But if the regulation isn't coming, we're going to end up being wrong. So we'll end up reversing course and you know, investing in different types of securities. One thing I would say on the carbon prices, I think regulation needs to be more thoughtful than just putting in a carbon price, because, you know, coming back to the point of the just transition, you know, if we don't have an energy basically a energy price transition that's reasonable for consumers, it's just not going to happen. And perhaps looking back at what the European Union did, or when they first implemented the emissions trading scheme, you know, we saw that it started off being implemented on just the utility sector and was supposed to spread out to several other industries, and this was in the mid-2000s. And when the financial crisis hit, we found that, you know, politicians were not able to tighten up that market again, because it would have been just too tough for the economy to take. So I think, you know, just having policies that are around carbon taxation just probably won't prove to be effective in the long run, and you'll probably just have a lot of start and stop action.
Martin, did you want to comment on that quickly before I turn to Melanie, or?
Yeah, no, I do believe that carbon prices are part of the answer. a universal carbon price on all is probably not the way, not the best way to go. I think a bit to what Maria was saying, that is maybe a bit too simplistic. So there are ways to differentiate and to treat certain sectors in different ways than other sectors. And always the question is, what do you do with the money? If you redistribute it in a way that does make the energy transition just again and fair again, then I'm all for carbon taxes. If it simply makes the life of the poor impossible to lead, to live, then you're on the wrong side of history. So when carbon tax, it can be used in a way to redistribute, to make the transition fair and to give the right incentives. But it also doesn't work in every sector. So it's worked very well in the power sector. But for example, in the light transport sector, it doesn't work at all. Because in Northwest Europe, taxes on petrol are quite high, as you know. If you simply look at the tax on petrol in Northwest Europe, the implied carbon price there is something like $240, and people still fill up every day. So putting $10 or $20 on that doesn't matter. There, if you want to get rid of internal combustion engine cars, you just need to put a mandate down, as the EU is now doing, saying they can't be sold anymore after 2035 or 2030. So the carbon price works in some sectors, but not in every sector. And you have to really decide where it will actually work, where you need government mandates, and how you deal with the social injustice effects of such a tax. But if you get all these three rights, I think there's a lot to argue for a carbon price or a set of carbon.
Melanie, I won't recap the whole last 30 minutes. Great to have you back with us. But one of the things we've been talking about, not surprisingly, is what I sort of quickly teed up after your opening remarks, when you noted opposition to transmission lines, opposition to pipelines. And I just made the observation that there are differences in what the concerns are. There's any infrastructure has potential environmental impacts and issues with wildlife and others, that or the views or the scenery that raise concerns about transmission lines. With pipelines, it's also a concern that if you're investing in hydrocarbon infrastructure and saying that's what the world needs today, but over time it can be used for the zero carbon energy that will be coming, there's skepticism about whether the second part's really going to happen, and whether in fact it locks in that hydrocarbon infrastructure that we want to over time move away from. So I was just wondering if you could talk about how do you see a tension there, and how do you think about resolving it in terms of what we should be building, what we should be financing, and what approaches policymakers should be taking toward investing the trillions we need in the energy system that both addresses the reliability, affordability, security of supply with the system we have today, but gets us to where we need to be in the long run.
And I kind of hinted at this in my remarks, is that what I am interested in, we are interested in, I think we should all be interested in, is investing in infrastructure that can be used in a net zero future. And so I'm not interested in anything else. But we do need things now. We're going to need things in the midterm. We're going to need things in the longer term. And I think it was Martin talking about this, the deep decarbonization and a carbon tax, a carbon fee and dividend, if you will, works very well in the power sector, because we have technologies for deep decarbonization. And I put in that, coal and gas with CCS as technologies for deep decarbonization. We don't have technologies for the industrial sector, not all of the technologies that we need. You cannot get high quality process heat from electricity. You need a fuel. That means you're going to have to capture the carbon. The technologies don't yet exist. And I think that we need to be very mindful of some of those things as we invest in infrastructure, provide and develop incentives for investing in infrastructure is how can they be repurposed and reused in a net zero future. And that's why I mentioned the CCUS pipelines. When we did a CCUS in California study, why is an industry investing in CCUS pipelines? And the answer was because that infrastructure could be stranded in 15 years. And so that is what got me thinking about, can I develop incentives to make those pipelines better than I might otherwise have to, so that they can be used for a hydrogen future. And I saw a lot of stuff on the chat before I left about green hydrogen versus blue hydrogen, and the costs of green hydrogen are coming down. Why would you do blue hydrogen? I think that those are very, very regional decisions. And it depends on the makeup of your power generation. It depends on what subsurface you have for sequestration. It depends on whether you have an industrial base that is highly reliant on hydrogen. And then let me say one other thing. When we talk about hydrogen, a hydrogen future and hydrogen for power generation, hydrogen, et cetera, whether it's green or blue hydrogen, hydrogen is currently a feedstock and a specialty chemical. It's not an energy commodity. We are talking huge amounts of hydrogen need if you're going to start using it as an energy commodity. And so we need to think about that and not think about these little discrete uses, distributed electrolysis with very low capacity factors, I might add, when you're talking about hydrogen as an energy commodity. There's also no pricing mechanism for that. There's no WTI, there's no Henry Hub. We price it as a specialty chemical. And so those are a range of issues that we need to work through as we're talking about green versus blue, et cetera, et cetera. So I wandered way off from the original question, but sorry. So what? Okay, it felt good. Thank you.
Can I, Jason, perhaps illustrate Melanie's point about, and I think you were there as well, about just how big that challenge is,
Right.
to scale of hydrogen. We are at the moment constructing the largest green hydrogen plant in the world in the Netherlands, or at least we have ordered the long lead, so we're on our way. 200 megawatt plant. And it will use 300 megawatts of offshore wind power, which is a third of one of the biggest wind farms in the North Sea. So these are relatively large plays. And once that the electrolyzer is on stream, let's call it 2024, it will produce enough hydrogen to keep 2,000 trucks on the road all day in Europe. And Europe has 6 million trucks. So just of this scheme, which is just, a third of a major wind farm and the biggest electrolyzer ever built, 20 times bigger than what we've done so far, you need 3,000 times that infrastructure in order to serve all trucks in Europe, long distance trucks, not the kind of inner city trucks, long distance trucks with green hydrogen instead of diesel that they use today. And that's the scale of the challenge. And we will need to do that before 2050. So it's nice that we're building one and we're proud, but Europe will need 3,000 of them. How many will the US need? How many will China need? And so you add it all together, and that gives you a sense for the enormity of the challenge and understanding of the frustration that people have. Why is this going so well? But I can promise you, when my electrolyzer comes on stream in 2.5 years, there won't even be 2,000 trucks in Europe to take it. We'll probably have 50 or 80, and then I'll start building the next one, hoping that it will come. So it is just saying the market isn't by itself going to solve this. We will need, and the EU Fit for 55 scheme starts to tell airlines to blend sustainable aviation fuel into their mix. 2%, 3%, 10%. We'll need similar mandates for trucks, because otherwise it just isn't going to happen on time.
Yeah, really interesting. And it's relevant. I've been spending a lot of time and wrote about this recently in a recent foreign policy column about what's happening in Europe today, but how to think about not the end state of transition, but the process of transition, and how messy and disruptive and unpredictable it might be, including with issues of affordability and reliability. So you start to imagine a world where a relatively small, but not insignificant, share of trucks are powered with that fuel. It's coming from a relatively small number of suppliers. There's a disruption with one of those suppliers. As Melanie said, there's not a global commodity market like WTI to go in and pull other supplies in. Thinking about the policy tools to smooth that transition, I think is important, not only for issues of reliability, but also to prevent a backlash against support for these policies if people think affordability and reliability may be negatively impacted. There are a couple of questions about kind of what is happening in the world today, and I'm kind of curious. A lot of this is just about the demand recovering maybe faster than investment and supply from a historic shutdown of the global economy, speculation about Russians playing politics. There's lots of things happening in Europe today, but we are seeing around the world an energy crunch, in not just in Europe, but some other parts of the world as well. There is, related to the broad topic of this panel, but even broader than that, I think, interest from people watching to understand what the causes and consequences are, and particularly what lessons, if any, maybe there aren't any, we should take about how we think about the energy transition from what we see happening in energy markets today. Melanie, I don't know if you want to comment on that, since you haven't had a chance to intervene as much, and then I'll
as
bring anyone
usual,
else in.
yeah, as usual, only marginally related to the question you asked, Jason, but not really. And something else that I've been thinking about and concerned about is, are we in any way, shape, or form, as a U.S. government, or the IEA for that matter, collecting the right data anymore to inform the energy transition? This is no longer about barrels of oil. It still is, okay? Oil is still important, and I think even the net zero study from IEA said that. But there are many, many other issues that are extremely modern, shall we say, that are cybersecurity related, that are metals and minerals related, that are LNG export related, that we need to be gathering data on to inform the question and answers that you just asked, Jason. And I really think we need to start thinking about that. It includes things like, obviously, cyber attacks, huge deal. Colonial Pipeline in the U.S. shut down from a hack cyber attack. Important for our energy infrastructure, but we are not gathering any data on that to inform what we should be looking at, analyzing, and promoting. And so I think, relative to the question you ask, and so which has some energy security implications, that we need to be informing energy security in very, very different ways than we have been informing it in the past. That is important to inform what infrastructures we need, how do we protect those infrastructures, how do we make them more reliable and resilient, et cetera, et cetera. So just a few thoughts. So,
Anyone else want to jump in on this?
If I can come in quickly, Jason. I think, and again, it's interesting to go a little bit back to the basics of what we're talking about in terms of this energy transition. If you think about, what energy has been like in the 20th century, especially in the second half of the 20th century, and where we are today, you are essentially dealing with very concentrated hydrocarbons around the world. And then we have, these massive operations to extract the hydrocarbons and then distribute them as effectively as we can around the world. what I think is the major paradigm shift in today's energy transition approaches is that we're essentially trying to capture very dispersed renewable energy, be it from wind, be it from solar, and then use technology to concentrate it and service our energy needs. These are two fundamentally very different paradigms that have, of course, very deep implications on energy security. So if you can kind of fast forward into a technological future, which, you know, may not be too far away, maybe it's just, 20 years, maybe 30 years, but you can envision easily a place where countries can generate the electricity that they need, store it in batteries, begin to transform it into hydrogen, and cover a very substantial amount of the energy needs without needing to import very much. And that has a profound impact on macroeconomic terms, less dependency on Forex, and less secure from an energy perspective. So I think, and I appreciate what Melanie said, that, we haven't really given enough thought to what this energy transition means as an end game, and what it might mean on the way it affects the economies, the geopolitics, and our broader strategic design. But I think, again, we shouldn't forget that, the younger generation of the world today expects an accelerated energy transition and an accelerated world clean energy system. And the fastest we can work towards it, I think, the better off we're all going to be together. So I think it does make sense to deal with these issues and think through them, because I think the potential from a positive perspective is very strong. And I think all these things that we call challenges, as Martin said, we need an enormous amount of electrolyzers to come online around the world. That is also a tremendous opportunity for whomever can build a more efficient and more affordable electrolyzer. This is just a tremendous opportunity for the world.
If I could jump in on this as well, maybe to talk about how the broader world beyond just the energy infrastructure is going to change because of this transition. A lot of the companies that we invest in today are currently looking at their scope 1 and 2 and scope 3 emissions for the first time. And companies are starting to think about net zero concepts and how they apply those to their businesses. So not just big heavy emitting industries, but apparel companies, shoe manufacturers, all sorts of industries are looking at doing this. And because of this, they're making business decisions that are not just related to their power supply. They're realizing that they can source things from different parts of the world or different areas. So I think, and we're really just at the cusp of companies starting to evaluate this. Maybe I'll throw out a couple statistics for you. So we at T-Row currently purchase in a carbon data set. So it has scope 1 and 2 emissions, and then also scope. We use it so that we can provide carbon footprints of all of our portfolios. And it covers about 16,000 companies. Today, 3/4 of the data is estimated for scope 1 and 2. So it's not a lot of companies that actually know their scope 1 and 2 emissions today. And 91% of the data is estimated for scope 3 emissions. So we're really kind of at the very tipping point of companies starting to rethink their businesses and how they want to plan it going forward. And, I think most of them before never thought about energy as anything other than cost. And that's changing.
Jason, if I could say something on that we were doing a global study of a global gas study, and our 78% of our LNG exports are going to OECD countries. So it's our trading partners and our allies, many of whom are horrified that they're not going to have our cleaner natural gas, to replace some of their dirty coal generation, or for use in industrial purposes, et cetera, et cetera. But in looking at that study, and a little bit to Maria's point, the global shipping emissions, which are 3% of total emissions, 2 to 3%. Not a huge amount, but when you're talking net zero, that's a huge amount. And those global shipping emissions are counted in no NDC, no one's. So when you start looking at your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, you have to start figuring out what those embedded emissions are. Okay, and shipping will figure heavily into that. And then as a world, and I think the World Bank would be a great place to think about this, coming up with standard methodologies for calculating that, the embedded emissions of a range of products. But I do worry about the scope 3, the net zero, and its impact on the least developed countries we are using their the cobalt in Democratic Republic of Congo, shipping it around the world. It's not counting against our NDCs, and it's counting against their emissions, and it's coming to us, and they're very dependent on that mining. So just a little more on the embedded emissions. We need to think carefully and very thoughtfully about that. So.
Let me bring one last audience question in before we wrap up. We've been talking about lots of sort of large industrial energy infrastructure like LNG or industrial facilities. And the question is about, well, this question of how we repurpose existing infrastructure, the question is particularly about the consumer side, how to think about home heating and water heaters and cooling appliances, and the role that some of the low carbon fuels we've been talking about might play in that. I think the conversation about heating, for example, is often electrification is the answer, and that may make sense in many cases, maybe not all. I'd love to hear whoever wants to jump in on that, or I can call on someone to comment on the household and on the consumer side of the question we're talking about today.
I can come in briefly if you. So I think that is a great question, first of all. But I think it's important to think about it also in a different way in terms of how individual households can suddenly come into the business of producing energy. And we started working a while back in India on a solar rooftop project. And it is fascinating how quickly it's picking up. And it is fascinating how suddenly you start looking at households not necessarily only as consumers, but you start seeing them also as stakeholders in the whole energy business. And that is a remarkable change as well. And it creates a sense of awareness about what energy is like, which is surprising what it can produce. So I just wanted to make this comment, not to answer the question, but to reframe the question itself, because I think it's an important aspect of it. Thanks.
It looked like Martin or maybe Melanie or both we're going to try to answer that question. Do you want to maybe each take 30 seconds and then wrap up?
Maybe I'll let Melanie close then. But agree with Richard. I think the prosumer model is very promising, and distributed generation will be a big answer to the problem about otherwise needing to build too much transmission. I do think, Jason, that in principle the built environment should electrify totally. There'll be some exceptions, but in principle it should electrify totally. The only big question you need to answer is it let's say by people installing heat pumps or is it by building hydrogen networks and people put a fuel cell in their home, and that's not a decision you can ask every consumer to take for themselves, because this is about public infrastructure. If you're going to go hydrogen, you need a hydrogen network that serves everybody, and that's a public infrastructure question. And too often at the moment, the consumers are told to go electrify their home heating, but by themselves they're never going to do it. They're never going to succeed. They need a government, whether it's city or state or national, to tell them how it's going to happen.
Melanie, 30 seconds, and then we'll bring it to a close.
The electrification of everything and its contribution to deep decarbonization depends on how you're generating your electricity. 10 regions in the United States EIA regions. I can't find the basis for them. One of the regions is 71% coal and gas generation. All of them are 50% or higher. Okay, many of them in the 60% range, except for the Pacific contiguous region. That's 36% gas or coal. It's all gas. Okay, they have a lot of hydro there. The hydro is having a lot of problems these days. People should look and see for the first time ever. EIA is counting hydro as non-dispatchable because of drought problems and melting glaciers. And so I think electrification is a good policy if you if you're not then running your home heating on coal. Okay, that would be an issue. And so I think it's a good policy. I prefer and the other thing I would say is everything runs on electricity, and we need significant work on cybersecurity issues if we are going to be running our home heat on electricity, because the world has 50 billion unhardened devices communicating with its electric grids. That's a little scary. So.
Great. All right. Thanks. Thanks to everyone. I really appreciate your making time to be with us. Thanks to all of our speakers for joining today, and to the audience for tuning in. As I mentioned, the full video of this event will be available on the Center on Global Energy Policy's website in a few days' time. Our next event will be the first in a multi-part series on the energy technology revolution, and it will focus on fusion. It will be held on Tuesday, October 12th at noon Eastern Time. For a full calendar of upcoming events, visit the Center on Global Energy Policy online. We hope you enjoy the rest of your day and look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.